All right, good morning. Today we will be continuing in our 1 Corinthians 7 study. It would be the marriage chapter, if you want to call it that. Before we go on with this morning, of course, you'll see we're starting in 1 Corinthians. So go ahead and turn there. While you're turning there, I'll read some books we actually have here in the church library about divorce, wedding, marriage. I went through nearly all of them. One of them is called Lawfully Wedded, What Constitutes Marriage in the Sight of God by Reynold Showers. Okay, it's just a pamphlet here. And I'm going to read his idea of it. Now that we've gotten through a little more of 1 Corinthians 7, maybe we can understand where he's coming from. He's talking about what makes a marriage lawful, what it is in the Bible. Here he's talking about the duration of the marriage covenant. Okay, so that's a big question. And he says here, because the marriage covenant is permanent, God declared that he hates divorce. And then he'll quote Malachi 2:16, of course, which we've already gone over. For I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel, and him who covers his garment with wrong, says the Lord of hosts. So take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. For the same reason God regards the breaking of the marriage covenant as adultery, whether it be in the form of infidelity or remarriage to a new mate after divorce. So see here he uses Malachi 2:16 to explain to us that there's never any reason for divorce except adultery or probably death. If there is divorce, then it happens outside of those two reasons. It's adultery across the board, no matter what. And that's what this book says. So we know better than that one. And this one here, The Divorce Myth by Laney. So this one he's going to get into, and the myth of divorce is, the myth here that he explains to us is that divorce is allowed or permissible. So that's the myth he's busting, okay? Not teach our way, the other way. So he's going to give us a little story, a little case study here. He says, and he's going over the teachings of Paul, which is what we're doing. So he's going to give us a little story here. Robert is a mature Christian businessman, and until recently, he's been active as a leader at his local church. He and his wife, Sherry, were happily married for 23 years and together raised 2 fine children. Now that their children are out of the nest, it would appear that this couple would be ready to sit back and enjoy the good life together. Okay? Then it happened. Without any warning or previous problems, Sherry told Robert she didn't love him anymore and wanted a divorce. Soon afterwards, Sherry moved away and began living with another man. Robert was devastated. It took him a year just to recover from the initial shock of the divorce and to begin to put the pieces of his life back together. Then he began asking, what should I do? He didn't enjoy living alone and wanted the companionship of a wife. Some would argue, on the basis of 1 Corinthians 7:15, that Paul allows for divorce and remarriage, not only in the case of adultery, but also in the case of abandonment. Does Robert have any right to remarry? What did Paul teach on the subject of divorce? Then he's going to take this chapter and explain to us what Paul teaches. And notice he's sitting right there in the verses we're using. So he goes through all this about Paul, 1 Corinthians 7. So here's the summary and conclusion. Like Jesus, the Apostle Paul confirms the principle of no divorce. Okay? The marriage union is binding until death. He's going to pull Romans on us. Under no circumstances, adultery, abandonment, should a believer seek divorce. No circumstances, no divorce ever. If divorce should take place in disregard of this instruction or prior to an understanding of it, Paul presents only 2 alternatives for the divorcee: reconciliation to one's spouse, or a lifelong single life. Paul taught a very strict position on divorce and remarriage, but then so did Jesus, both recognizing that God's plan for marriage was a union that was binding and permanent for life. Now you recall, Moses has already had laws. Okay. If Robert asked an unbeliever, Pastor Reed, what he should do about his separation from Sherry, the advice he would probably receive would to be forget about her and find a good woman to enjoy the rest of your life with. That's the unbeliever. Since Robert does not want to live a single life, his prayers should be for reconciliation. But how can Robert love again his adulterous and unfaithful wife? How can he be reconciled to someone who's hurt him? So in other words, how can he remarry his ex? Right? Okay. As Jesus said in Matthew 19:26, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. The world recommends divorce when one's own meager resources of love and forgiveness are exhausted, but God delights in restoring marriages and thus proving to a skeptical world the reality and power of his love. So that's, now can you believe this is a Christian book on divorce and remarriage? The divorce myth. You cannot get divorced ever. Okay, now that's the myth we know. But yes, he's using the same exact verses we've been going over. And now that we've gone over these for the last couple of weeks, now you guys can recognize this as the false doctrine it is. So we're going to read through what we've got going on this morning. Look at verse 12 there in 1 Corinthians 7, which is where this guy was pulling from. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife that believeth not, and she is pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. All right? And the woman which has a husband that believes not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her leave not him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Okay, so here's what we're studying today. This is the big issue. Read, what if I'm with a spouse that doesn't believe? One or the other. Notice Paul says it can be the husband or wife who's an unbeliever in the marriage. All right? So, last week I told you guys about the importance of reading and studying the life and times of these people in the Bible, especially the people that Paul here is writing to in Corinth. These people are Corinthians then, and later on in the second letter, Paul will go on to tell them that they are a beloved church of his. Okay, so these are important believers to Paul. If you go over to Acts 18 quickly, you'll see where these Corinthians, a little bit of a backstory about them. Look at Acts 18:1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Okay, so he's going to Corinth to preach. Look at verse 8. And Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and they were baptized. So here's the case. These Corinthians here listened to the preaching. As Paul went to Corinth, they believed and were baptized, so they became Christians. So these Corinthians that Paul's writing to here are Corinthian converts. Probably, many of them were not lifelong Christians at this point. They had some questions on specifics. And this is what Paul's doing. So Paul preached to them. Apparently they heard and believed and were baptized, and they became Christians. And these letters here are their questions to Paul about Christian life, okay? Now the Corinthians here, they lived in a society that did not hold to Christian ideals. This is a relatively new thing in the world at this time. And if you look at Corinth, it was actually a mixture of peoples. You had Greek, Roman, and Jew or Jewish peoples' beliefs in this city. Okay, Corinth was a big to-do city in Rome. It was actually the capital of the Roman province, Achaia at the time. So they had a lot of issues with this. And the problem these Corinthians were facing is that they were facing persecution for their Christian beliefs in this day. As a matter of fact, if you look at 1 Corinthians 7:26, I believe, he calls that the present distress. The present distress that Paul's speaking of is the times that these people were believing Christianity in the city of Corinth was causing distress between the Roman government and themselves, and of course other people that practiced different religions, maybe even family members. That's why this is coming about. So these new Corinthian converts, because they were Christians, it put them at odds with society. All right? And one issue is discussed, like we said, the idea that they were practicing celibacy there at the previous sermon that I gave. That came from the society that they lived in at the time. See, now Corinth was known to be rather liberal when it came to relations that way. All right, back to 7. So now we know the Corinthians are new converts. They're asking Paul questions. One of the questions they asked is, but to the rest speak I not the Lord, if a brother has a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the wife and the woman which has a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. So the Corinthians now, they've got two questions that we've been discussing, just two. Earlier sermons, they said, Paul, is divorce permitted? Which he answers the question. Yes, of course it is. Jesus told us all about that. And we went over that a couple sermons ago. Now they're asking, Paul, is divorce required? Is it required if I'm a Christian and I have a husband that doesn't believe, or vice versa? Does being a Christian require that I divorce my husband now? Obviously, the marriage was there when one or the other turned to Christianity. Okay, so this is a marriage that's already exists. They're not going out and finding non-Christian mates. So, we've covered, like I said, that it was indeed permitted. Jesus and Moses and Paul testified to such. Okay, so that's not the divorce myth, like we just read out of that book. So I'll have to get that because we'll pull it up later. And verses 12 and 13 are answers given by Paul. So if one or the other is an unbeliever, yet they're pleased to dwell together, let that continue. And that's probably the answer to like 90% of the questions that come across my desk about marriage is right here. So why does Paul say this? If you have an unbelieving wife, if you have an unbelieving husband, if you're pleased to dwell together, continue to do that. Why does he say that? Well, look at verse 15. Because God has called us to peace. So Paul's putting a premium on a peaceful household. Right? That makes the list. So if one or the other is a Christian and the other is not, and yet they can have a peaceful marriage or a peaceful home, let that continue. Right? That's what Paul's saying. So let's go over this a little more closely. Look at 15. But if the unbeliever depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So if the unbeliever departs or wishes to depart, let him go. Let him go. Because of peace. To have peace in your life. The reason is a believer is not bound to an unbeliever. This unbeliever and believer are not bound together. You see, he's saying, look, you're not obligated to stay together in this case because God has called us, the Christians, to peace. If the situation is one of heartache or insurmountable incompatibility, right? And divorce is the only option in which peace can be obtained, let it be. Just let it be. Now what's interesting is while I was writing this sermon, actually someone called me. I never heard from them before. I'm not really sure if they're even a current listener. I assume they weren't, given the questions they were asking me. It was obvious they hadn't listened to my sermon, like the last two at least. He was asking me about questions on marriage and divorce. And I said, oh, well, you must be listening to my sermons because that's what I'm preaching on right now. He said, no, I'm not familiar with you or at least those sermons. So I'm like, okay. And I said, well, what's going on? And he was telling me the situation. I'm like, yeah, I'm writing a sermon about that right now. And he laughed. He's like, well, how was I calling you? And I'm like, hey, if it was me, I'd take it as a second witness. Because out of nowhere, you called me. I've never heard from you before, asking me the exact question that's answered by these verses in Paul's letter to Corinthians, right? So I was like, okay, look. If she's not pleased to dwell with you, which she wasn't, she left. I was like, then let her go. Because God's called you to peace, Christian. Let her go. If there's something that's so big, in this case it was drugs and an old lifestyle she returned to, well, then let her go if that's her thing. And we'll get to why he had this question about, as a Christian, can he do that? And we'll get to that here in a second. And like I told the guy, divorce is not the original ideal. It's not. But neither is a marriage of continued strife and resentment. That's not the original idea either. God doesn't expect us to stay in a loveless marriage for life. He's called us to peace. And if you're a Christian and you're in a loveless marriage that's full of nothing but heartache and strife, how much of that is being exemplified to other people who you want to be Christians as well? And you're like, take it from me, Christianity's the way to be. Just look at my marriage. And then they take a look at it and they're like, well, if that's Christianity, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Well, of course they don't. Because you're not showing what? What God's called us to do. Peace. Right? And like I said, if we took this book here, the divorce myth, as an absolute truth, then both Jesus and Paul require celibacy or lifelong marriage that's full of power struggles. That's what this man told us. He said, well, no, divorce is never on the table. If you do get divorced, you need to be reconciled with her. Obviously, he didn't know the law of Moses, because that's impossible. Or two, well, since you're Christian, you're bound to a lifelong of loveless marriage. And you know you've come across people who are indeed married, who live in the same house, who are miles and miles away from one another. You know that because there's a big dragon in that room, right? Then we'll talk about it. I know married couples who stay together for whatever reason, and they're not, for practical purposes, that is not a peaceful, loving home. Miles from each other. Can't stand the sight of each other. But divorce is not an option. They're bound. Opposite of what Paul said, he said, a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. What cases? Where they want to go, where there's nothing but strife in the house. You as a Christian, you're not bound to that. Why? Well, God's called us to peace. We're supposed to show the peace to others so that they'll turn and be fascinated by our lives, right? So if God, if what this book we are reading is true, then why does Paul add, if she or he is pleased to dwell? If divorce is never an option, then their feelings about it is beside the matter, right? Then why is Paul considering, hey, look, if this is how you feel about it, if this is how you assess the marriage, well, if divorce is not an option ever, then how you feel about it is irrelevant. It's immaterial. What the wife or husband has considerations about in the marriage means nothing, because there's no divorce ever except for death. And if you do go through with it, you're an adulteress. You're living in adultery. You guys heard that? Continuously living in adultery. You can't continuously live in adultery. Adultery is an act. Once it's done, it's done. You can't unscramble an egg. So you're not continuously living in adultery. There's ways to deal with that too, which we'll get to. But look again in verse 15. Now we have to understand here now that the lack of peace is the case for the departure. Not because he or she was an unbeliever. The lack of peace is why Paul says, let them go. Don't get rid of them just because they don't believe exactly like you. He's not saying that, is he? Because the fact is that the departed was an unbeliever here is only a factor because of the peace, because of the lack of peace, you see? So they didn't depart because they're straight up an unbeliever. They departed because of the lack of peace in the home. All right? And that's what this is going to get twisted quick. Because Paul says, if a unbeliever is pleased to remain, let him remain. Okay? So that's fine. That happens. But if he's not, let him go. Paul didn't get into all the specifics here. And that's why I'm saying this. Because if he departed in verse 15 just because of an unbelief, if that was the only factor, then that means really what Paul's saying is that any two Christians are compatible with each other. They're not. There are Christians in this age that the only thing they have in common is the fact that they are Christians. That's it. Right? So you can go out, and if you just go out and marry any Christian, then that means you're 100% compatible, right? Across the board. Well, no, see, Paul's not saying that either. He's not saying, well, if they're an unbeliever, get rid of them. And for goodness sake, go find a Christian. Now, we should be looking for Christian mates. But just because someone's Christian doesn't mean that you guys are going to be able to have a lifelong marriage together. It doesn't mean that. Okay? That could be, like I said, all you have in common. That's fine. That's fine. So if both parties are Christians, yet they're not pleased to remain together, then they can go their separate ways too, right? Because in a Christian home, even though two may be Christians, there could be unrest. They could not be compatible with each other, and the other Christian could depart one over the other to be called to peace. So that's fine. Certainly Christians should marry Christians. Certainly. But I'm not saying go out and just ask somebody if they're a Christian, and if they say they are, that's your partner for life. You need to do some checking. That's fine. This is a lifelong commitment you're about to go and get into, right? Of course, prayer about your partner is a big, big deal. Nothing wrong with throwing out fleeces either. Gideon did that and wasn't condemned, was he? Make sure this is a lifelong thing. But dating Christians and finding out if they're compatible with you for life is important, just as important as finding out the other things about them. Okay, like when I was a boy, I've been raised in the kingdom ministry for my entire life. So I thought for sure I was going to find a good girl in church. That was going to be it. I was going to go, and I knew that I had to find a Christian woman because of the Christian home I came from. And I went to the churches, and there were a lot of Christian girls that I was like, well, they're nice, but they're not necessarily wife material. And if I believed that just making a Christian was just made you a good wife, well, then I would have just married the first girl I ran into in church. But it didn't, because God has plans for our lives, and sometimes if you talk about an unbeliever, well, which we'll get into, an unbeliever is what, a non-kingdom believer? Are they unbelievers? Right? Okay, so yeah, we're going to get into that. What is an unbeliever then? And Paul, what he's talking about here, he's talking about black and white pretty much. Christian versus non-Christian in Corinthians, okay? He's not talking about a Protestant that wants to marry a Catholic. He's not talking about that. He's not talking about a Baptist that wants to be with a Methodist. Because, you know, people believe that way nowadays. If you're a Baptist, if you're anything but Baptist, then anybody else they're unbelievers. They're not part of our church, right? And it starts to get really, Paul's not talking about this. Actually, he condemned denominations later on, didn't he? Because of this thing. So when you have, and I've seen it, you have a Wesleyan get with, Methodist, they're kind of like sister churches anyway, but you got a Wesleyan and wants to get with a non-Wesleyan. Well, you're with a non-believer. If you got a Lutheran and a Calvinist together, the fur is going to fly, right? Because they're non-believers. My wife's a heathen, she's a Calvinist. You know, where it really gets crazy, I know it sounds silly, but in the kingdom ministry, this gets really messy. You could have a full-blown Christian who's not a kingdom believer, which does happen in this age. Okay? I know plenty of Christians that aren't kingdom believers. A whole lot of them. More, right, exactly, more. I know more Christian non-kingdom believers than I do Christian kingdom believers. It's a handful of us. But in the kingdom ministry, and this comes across my desk, well, I'm a husband. My wife and I are both Christians. We both got married as Christians. Then I, as the husband, heard the word of the kingdom ministry, turned and believed that. My wife's still holding out. She's a non-believer, isn't she, Reed? I said, no, she's not a non-believer. She's not a heathen. She doesn't understand the gospel of the kingdom. That's fine, right? She doesn't grasp it, or she hasn't thought about it long enough, maybe. But she's not a heathen. So is this a mixed marriage? Possibly. There may be some things that you talk about at the house, kingdom ministry-wise, that isn't going to quite compute with the church she goes to, right? Now, that happened to me. Believe it or not. Pastor Reed did not go out and find this full-blown kingdom believer, and we both got right along, and she knew everything I knew, end-time prophecy, mystery Babylon. She's like, oh yeah, she didn't come out quoting Bible verses. 10 years, she went to another church. Plenty of churches, right? Was she kingdom? No. Did I believe that she understood who Jesus Christ the King was and what he's supposed to do? And she said, yes. It was fundamentalists. But I thought, well, look, you want to go to the church and be a part of the church and the women's group and all that, do so. I didn't think it could hurt going and hanging out with other Christians who were good people, singing praise and worship songs, cracking the Bible, reading some stuff out of it. I thought, what could it hurt? Personally, I didn't go to every service because I told her once, well, I'm just not going to learn anything. And I didn't. And I'd cause arguments, and I'd embarrass her when I brought my concordance to church. She called me a bull in a china shop. I was almost escorted out of one church because I called a deacon a false prophet. And It embarrassed my wife, but then I calmed down a little bit. But you see, she was, for practical purposes, if I were to believe what other kingdom people tell me, well, then my wife was an unbelieving heathen, and it's all I could do to teach her the kingdom. But no, she came around, and she was a non-practicing Catholic, right? It turns out it's much, much easier for someone to learn the kingdom gospel when they don't have to reverse 18 years of bad preaching from another church. You see, she was non-practicing. She didn't really do anything with religion. So when you start talking about the Bible, and she'd come home after church and be like, hey, look, we learned about this. What's this mean? And then I tell her, okay, well, look, here's this, here's this, here's this. Then eventually she's like, okay, this is helping me understand the Bible more than anything I've ever done in those churches. I'm like, well, of course it is. You know, so when you have an unbelieving non-kingdom spouse, you know, do you have a mixed marriage religiously? Possibly. But if it pleases you to go on with that woman, then do so. Right? If I had just said, oh no, I'm going to drop this, well, God knew what he was doing when he put us together, didn't he? So in Corinth, some marriages were mixed in this regard. One was a Christian, one was a non-Christian. Okay? So, since these marriages currently existed, we know that because they're asking, Paul, is divorce required? Okay, so these are existing marriages. So, like I said with our mixed marriages today, if you have a kingdom-believing spouse versus a non-kingdom-believing spouse, if you guys can be in accord and your house is peaceful, then continue on with it. Right? No need. Otherwise, Paul would have broken up hundreds of marriages. I would have had to break up hundreds of marriages by now, if that was the case. Right? Sometimes the non-believing spouse, it is a big problem. I'd say an easy one. Don't eat pork. Right? That's easy. If all of a sudden you don't do that at the house, that's a big change. Right? For whatever reason. And if they don't want to deal with that, let them go, because you're going to be sitting on that same problem for the rest of your life if they continually buck the system, right? And if it gets to where it's unpeaceful, just be done with it. We're not called to that. Power struggles. Just let it go. So, look at 16. I'm already past that. 16. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband, or how thou knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? But as God has distributed to every man, as the Lord has called every one, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. So, some people now, they suppose that if they stay married, they have to stay married or remain in a bad marriage because they might be able to save the unbelieving spouse. And you guys have all heard this. You've all seen this. And they use this verse 16 to do so, right? But notice, verse 16 has question marks in it. Okay? If it's true that the believing party can have, it is true. Your believing spouse, you can have a positive and godly influence on your non-believing spouse. Okay? But simply staying with them does not guarantee they will one day turn and believe. That's what Paul's saying. Okay, and you know this. You people that are married, you know what peace is in your house. You know what a good godly wife and husband, you know what they are, you know how to conduct yourselves as that. So yes, you can have a good influence on your wife. And this is where it's going to start all coming around to every single one of us. Paul's not here advocating that one should simply stay with an unbelieving spouse because the possibility exists that they may someday be converted. He's not saying that. If he meant that, he just undid everything he spoke about 3-4 verses ago, didn't he? So, we as mortals do not know the future. So do not stay in ungodliness. You're to go and find peace and seek life more abundantly, right? How can you do that if you're bound to someone because of their disbelief? Because the possibility exists they might turn. Don't stay in a marriage just because you are responsible for the unsaved spouse. It doesn't work that way. And I'll get to why it doesn't. Because there is no assurance to you, wives, that your husbands will be converted if you stay. There's none. Nobody knows that. And the same can be said, husbands, concerning your wives. If you're a Christian and your marriage is ended, do not feel guilty about that partner's discontinued belief. That wasn't on you. That was this guy's question Friday. He's like, well, Reed, I stayed with her and I tried to clean up her life and she didn't want it bad enough, she left. What do I do? Do I keep trying to get with her and trying to stay with her so that I can show her the goodness and way of life of Christianity so that we can save a soul? No, you're not bound to that. Don't do that. Right. Because that's why, exactly. So I asked him, I said, look, it's not up to you in the first place. Pastor Reed, John Hagee, Joel Osteen, none of those men, including myself, have ever saved a soul. We do not do that. You can't do that, even in the case of your own spouse. Because at the end of the day, who gets the glory for saving that soul if it was you? Man, right? No, God's not about to leave it up to that. Now, I would love that unbelieving spouse become kingdom believers. I'd absolutely love that if all would be saved that way. It'd make things a lot easier. But that's not the age we live in. So, if that's the case, is someone else's salvation left up to us or any man? No. It's God that does the calling. It's God that does the choosing. Like I said, a good, godly husband or wife can have influence, good influence on someone's life. We're not to be stumbling blocks, right? But God, Jesus, now he got in big trouble for saying the same thing I just said, really. Go Luke 4, you know this one. Jesus got in some big trouble. Luke 4:23. And he said unto them, now he's at church in his hometown. They know who Jesus is. They just asked about him. They said, isn't this Joseph's son? And he said unto them, you surely will say unto me this proverb, Physician, heal thyself. Whatsoever you have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in thy country. And he said, Verily I say unto you, no prophet is accepted in his own country. But I tell you the truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, when the famine was throughout all the land. But none of them was Elijah sent, save Sarepta, a city of Sidon, unto a woman that was a widow. And many lepers were in Israel at the time of Elisha, the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, saving Naaman the Syrian. And all they that heard in the synagogue, when they heard these things, were filled with wrath, and rose up and thrust him out of the city, and led him unto the brow of the hill whereon the city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. But he, passing through the midst of them, went his way. What did Jesus just say to those people in church? Jesus says, I'll save who I want. I'll do what I will. Now, when Jesus told the people in church that, they took him out and they were going to throw him off a cliff. Because Jesus said, I save whom I will. Even Naaman the Syrian. No one else's salvation is dependent on you. Not your friends, not your coworkers, not your schoolmates, not your families, not even your own spouse. And if you want to get to children, which we'll get to, you do what you're supposed to do with your children while they're in the home. God will do the rest. If it's God's will they're saved, they'll be saved. If not, they won't be saved. He'll get the glory either way, won't he? Right? Yes, I personally would will that they would all be saved. I could pray about it, but ultimately it's not up to me. Not even kingdom ministers have that power. Not even ministers. We always know it's God and it's in God's hands. He gave us the children, they belong to him. If he wants them in the kingdom, they'll be there. Well, if you're currently married to an unbeliever, whether a non-Christian outright or a Christian of another denomination, I know it's weird people think of people that recognize Jesus Christ as king, but they're still not believers because they don't know the kingdom gospel, right? And they'll teach, Arthur and I have talked about this quite a little bit. Well, Pastor Reed, don't you know that the Baptist church, now I have good Baptist friends who love Jesus and do everything he says. Really, they do. Sometimes it's to an extreme or two. But there's no doubt in my mind that they recognize Jesus as the Messiah and King of this earth. And they've told me as such. And I'm like, okay, so you're Christians. Well, the other kingdom ministers will naysay that. And they'll be like, well, Reed, look, then you know that Jesus is not the Jesus we know. So it's a different Jesus, a different gospel, a different Bible. And they have no right to call or invoke Jesus' name. After all, it's only us kingdom believers that know the real thing. And then they'll just sit on that for life. What a waste. Anyway, if you have a spouse that is another denomination or an outright non-Christian, and they have a different background, but you're not sure if they'll turn, you continue in peace if it pleases the two of you. Okay? The Christian marriage still has a duty, though. The Christian in the marriage, he still has a duty. This is important. 1 Peter, I know that's a difficult one to find. Mine is marked. 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2. So I'll read it. You guys already know these. Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may be without the word, be won by the conversation of the wives. The word conversation is conduct, lifestyle. While they behold, who? The unbelieving husbands. While they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. What is going on here? All right. So if the believer remains, they are duty bound to continue acting as a Christian, because that's a matter of Christian duty. Number one. Number two, we're not to be stumbling blocks to others, even your own spouse, even your own unbelieving spouse. You are to show, both in conduct and lifestyle, Christianity and the fruits of it. Why? Because you're being watched. You're being watched. So stay in this marriage with an unbeliever, but do not be derelict in Christian duty. Subjection to your husbands. Careful. Believing wives, that doesn't mean when your husband serves you up a pork chop, you must eat it because you're under his roof. No, you cannot break. Husbands cannot give unlawful orders. It's impossible. Wives, Christians, do not obey unlawful orders. Because here's one, if wives or husband, if your wife who hates the kingdom gospel and has nothing to do with it and insists on serving you pork chops every night, well, there as a husband, you're powerless, and Jesus didn't leave that. He left all that to chance, so eat the pork chop to keep the peace. No, because the same Christians that say, well, wives have to submit, eat the pork chop. It came from your husband, you ungrateful, right? No. It's better to obey God than men. There's your ace in the hole. Everybody loves that verse except for when it comes to this one in Peter. Right? Yes, don't eat the pork chop. Don't do it. Don't do anything unlawful your husband or wife orders you to do. Don't do that. Be Christian. Right? That'll also get into whether you could eat at a guest's house, which we've covered this before in the food laws. If someone serves you something unlawful, just because you're a guest doesn't mean you're allowed to eat it. Okay? All right. Yeah. Jesus' blood covered all of it. Okay, all of it. Every case. So Peter says, hey, look, wives, you may be with an unbelieving husband. That's fine. Paul said you could do that if you can continue in peace. But while you're continuing in peace, you will act like a Christian, because he may just be won over by your godly conversation. Happens all the time, doesn't it? It's a wonderful thing when it does happen. Look at Galatians 5. We're supposed to be showing Christian lifestyle and the fruits of it. Galatians 5:22. You guys know these. What are the fruits of Christianity? Well, Paul tells the church in Galatia, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Paul says, while you're with your husband and you tell him you're Christian, he should be able to see love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness in your life, shouldn't he? Because that's the fruits of being a Christian. And of course, Paul here at the very end says, against such there is no law. Well, I know quite a few pastors who try to outlaw peace for people by making them stay in marriages. They've outlawed that. They've denied that to that Christian. What? Love, joy, peace. They've outlawed them because you are not allowed those things because once upon a time you got divorced. Jesus' blood covers all the rest of your sins except for that divorce. Is that where this goes? Talk about shortening God's hand. And that was the thing I accused that deacon of. He had shortened God's hand. I used Bible prophecy to prove it. Ezekiel 33, if I'm not mistaken. Now think of our buddy, our poor buddy Robert here. Right? Remember him? Well, peace and love are forbidden to him, according to this book, right? And Paul says you can't outlaw these things. That's the Christian walk. God wants us to have these things. He even mentioned peace all the way back over there in Corinthians. But according to this man, our buddy Robert, love and peace are forbidden to him because he either has to continue with the she-devil Sherry or live a life of solitude. Right? No love, no joy, no peace, no long-suffering. You either get back with that adulterous woman or you stay single for the rest of your life because God hates divorce. You see how this is preached? And these are questions that get asked to me over the phone while I'm writing these. Reed, if I get divorced, I can't do it for any other reason but death. Then you're doomed to a life of solitude and misery. I'm not saying the single life is miserable, but if it's not for you, then by all means get married. That's what Paul told us to do because he's not about to outlaw love, joy, and peace as this man did, right? He's outlawed it. No, in the case of Rob here, both Pastor Reed and Paul would urge him to pursue things as a lawful Christian. As a lawful Christian. If it's in her mind to go, let her go. Lawfully divorce the woman, pick up the pieces, and move on. Paul tells us this later on in the Corinthian letter. Actually, he's talking about widows. He's like, hey, widows. Now, in the Bible, you have widows who have living husbands, and you have widows who have dead husbands. Okay, the living husband widows. It does happen. I know it sounds weird. The grass widows. Grass widows, right? You guys familiar with that term? Do it. Okay. Remember back in the day in the Old Testament, we're supposed to leave sheaves behind? Grass widows? Okay, so anyway, a widow could be a widow because her husband outright died, or because he just never came back. Could be living. And Elijah, we were talking about that guy. Remember the widow? And Elijah. She says, I'm a widow and my husband is dead. Well, I thought that you were a widow because your husband is dead. She's like, no, I'm a widow and my husband is dead. So I know for sure the man's dead. I'm a real widow. Okay? It's not a widow and my husband's living somewhere else because he abandoned me, because the marriage died. Right? Yeah. Very important marital law. We're not going to get into it all this time. We'll get into it later when we have to understand the Bible as a covenant marriage. But yes, grass widows and widows. So, and that's why I was saying about the depart. Sometimes husbands left and never came back. They didn't know if they were dead or alive. They didn't know if the guy left because he really hated the wife or he left and meant to come back to her and just never got the chance to. Right? They didn't have death certificates and stuff back then. All right? So, you should pursue your marriage or the single life as a lawful Christian. That's what Paul's saying. Because you're being watched. People are watching us, our spouse or otherwise, and they may see the good in our lives because we call ourselves Christian and because we have Christian attitudes. Now that statement there is actually the basis for my 2 conference sermons right there. That's the basis for my Kingdom Conference sermons this year. So we're not going to get into all that. But you remember, wives, husbands, continue acting like a Christian because it's just a matter of Christian duty, and you may convince them to be a Christian because of the fruits you're supposed to have in your life. I'm going to attack why Christians in this age say they're Christians, but yet they can show no fruits of it. None. I know a whole lot of Christians that are not joyful and not peaceful people. Why? Why? What's wrong here? That'll be this conference sermon. So, how could someone be turned on to Christianity through me if I fail to exemplify the things Paul's talking about? If all I show them is how much I hate my wife, they're like, well, I don't want anything to do with that. And I wouldn't blame them. If all I can do in my life is tell them about how many fires I've got to put out and how bad I got the creditors at the door and I got to turn off the lights and shut the curtains, I'm like, man, I don't want anything to do with this Christianity thing you're talking about because it's nothing but trouble, right? What a billboard for Jesus. Join Jesus's ranks and live in misery because divorce isn't an option. I'm like, well, I'm going to go to a religion that says it is. Thank you very much. Don't go to Mormonism. That one's sealed for life. All right, that's the sealed marriages thing. That's where it gets really weird. All right, so that's what we're going to discuss in the conference. How do you turn people on to Christianity when you yourself don't have any of the fruits? Okay, so Paul was against being a marital missionary then, okay? And you see this a lot too. Well, they're not Christian, but if I get married to them, I'll change them. Right? Well, Paul, first of all, in Corinthians, they're already married. Okay? We're going to get to their questions. By all means, try to find a Christian. But don't go out and be like, well, there's a few things I could tweak, but I'll just wait till after the matrimony. Then I really got them. If it ends up being an unpeaceful life, get out of there. We're not called to that. You're not bound to that. Okay? So we're not talking about missionary dating. Paul's not talking about that either. We're not talking about arranged marriages either. Okay, biblical courtship, we're not going to get into that. To answer a question on YouTube very quickly, look, Reed, I read in the Bible we're supposed to do biblical courtship, and wouldn't you know, in the OT, they picked out wives, and that's the way they did it, so that's the way we need to do it. Very quickly, Benjamin went in the book of Judges, watched the women dance, decided which one they liked better, and made that their wife. So don't follow that biblical example, right? I know it's in the Bible. David went and got a whole bunch of Philistines' foreskins to be engaged. Michelle, right? Remember that? I would say in this age, a diamond ring's just fine. Okay? So yes, I know it's in the Bible, but that doesn't make it something we have to stick to today. Okay? There's a whole lot of things in the Bible. The biblical courtship and the husband being picked out for the daughter of the man, the arranged marriage thing, that was a Bible tradition, a Bible custom, not Bible law. If you quote the covering chapters, you're going to automatically be stepping into vows, not marriage vows, no such things. Going to a marriage altar, taking the vows, till death do you part's not in the Bible. It's not. It's tradition. That doesn't make it improper. Being married at an altar doesn't make it improper, but that's not how they did it in the Bible days. Okay, so things change with the times and seasons and ages. That's fine. But don't be so rich. That's a paper pope. You guys know what a paper pope is? Taking the Bible so literally you can't make room for everyday life. One of which is this arranged marriages thing. And they almost never work out anymore. Arranged marriages were more of an economic thing back then. Okay? That's really why. And of course, military alliances were big on that too. That's why you wanted your daughter to marry a king or vice versa. So anyway, there's that one. Also, another question that comes to mind, someone asked me, well, if God was married to Israel and Judah, then that makes God a polygamist. Well, yes, it does. But polygamy is not illegal in the Bible either. That's fine. God likens his marriage to two sisters, Judah and Israel, right? Jacob had multiple wives, Noah, Solomon. Solomon had a lot of women. But that is polygamy, being married to more than one wife, is fine in the Bible. It's not illegal. It's certainly not a sin. And he was right. Yeah, God is a polygamist. That's fine. I can live with that because it's not illegal. Is it impractical economically now? Yes. Is it against the law? Yes. Man's law. That's fine. Okay, that's why Joseph Smith got kicked out of every state he lived in. So, Mormonism again. So, don't be a marital missionary. If you get married thinking you're going to rescue that person, or you stay married thinking you're going to rescue that person or save their souls, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And it will end in strife every time, because it's just going to be a power struggle for your entire life. And I say it all the time. I've been married 15 years. What good's a power struggle? As I get older, I put a high premium on peace, like Paul does. The peace and rest of the kingdom, which you read about on almost every page in this book. And most Christians don't have one lick of it. So, what about verse 14? Look at verse 14. You think I skipped it? I didn't. Let's see. There. Okay, verse 7:14. Let's see what that is. We'll start wrapping up here. Like I said, we'll cover the rest of this at the after I get home from the conference. 7:14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. And see, people use this verse right there and say, see, read, I've got to stay with my unbelieving wife to sanctify her. Because if I don't save her, who will? It's up to me. Jesus left it up to me. His work on the cross wasn't enough. It's up to me. Now, there's a commentary that I read on this, and it was pretty slick how he gets around this verse. All right, I don't remember which commentary it was. It was an old one, so I just made a copy. Verse 14 is sanctified, literally has been sanctified. The status has been rendered theoretically clean. Okay, by the wife, literally in the wife. The bond is still holy. Its holiness rests in the believing wife or husband. This reasoning would remove any scruples which Corinthian Christians here, okay, might derive from Deuteronomy 7:3. Now, Deuteronomy 7:3, very quickly, that's where God's telling us not to marry into the forbidden lineages of Canaan. Deuteronomy 7:2, he'll list the 7 great nations, Girgashites, Perizzites, you know that, right? Then he'll say, don't marry them, don't make covenants with them, because your daughters will be idol worshipers. So will your sons. That's what's forbidden. So he's saying, okay, look, believing wife, Deuteronomy 7:3, the liberty implied by these remarks, contrasting so strongly with the rigid rules laid down in the days of Ezra, and then he quotes Ezra 9 and Nehemiah 9, which was the putting away of people who were fornicating with forbidden lineages or mixed blood marriages, right? Which we know those weren't really marriages. The days of Ezra recall this change in Paul's dispensation. Verse 14. Thou they are holy, because, Romans 9:11, if the root be holy, so are the branches. So you see what this commentary's done. It's really sneaky, and I don't know if you caught it. But he's saying, look, the sanctifying husband, the unbelieving is sanctified by the believer, right? Husband or wife, doesn't matter. Well, he's saying, well, that's good news, because Paul in his dispensation now to dispense, to stop with something and start with something else, right? Paul's leaving off the words of Deuteronomy 7 and Ezra and Nehemiah. Paul's saying, look, I know God told us not to marry the Canaanite. I know God told us not to have interracial relationships, but Paul says that's okay because those two are sanctified. Thank goodness we have Paul saying that we can get back with the Canaanites we've always wanted to marry and those mixed blood relatives of ours. You see? Because we all came from Adam, so it's okay to marry everybody. Because Paul, undoing Jesus and Moses, says, well, no, that's fine. Marry Canaanites, because if the root be holy, so are the branches. That verse shouldn't even be used there. That's talking about Christ and his church, not married couples, right? He's also not saying go and marry Canaanites because she'll be a believer one day. Canaanite or not, Moabite or not, Perizzite or not, right? No, Girgashite? No. He's saying this poor pastor here thinks that the marriage to a Canaanite and the marriage to a mixed blood race is actually a marriage. It's not. Nope. He's misled there. Those are not marriages recognized by God. Uncle Sam, Nebuchadnezzar can call them marriages, but lawfully are they marriages in God's eyes? Absolutely not. Paul's not talking about them. He's talking about real full-blown husbands and wives. Legitimate marriages is one. 2, sanctification. All right. So what he's talking about is the fact that one partner or the other is Christian makes this a lawful union in God's eyes. All right? You'll see this as well in today's age. you have a Christian couple, one of the other is the Christian. They're only aware of what the Christian definition of marriage is, and they stick to that, which makes the marriage a lawful union, in spite of what the unbeliever may think or say about it, right? That's all Paul's talking about. Very easy. So otherwise, you're telling me that in mixed religions, marriages, like what Paul's talking about, it's not 100% a marriage until both of them agree 100%? Then it starts being a marriage? That's what he's saying, right? Or is it a marriage because one Christian knows what marriage is and they stick to that, right? Okay. And you could even get into, well, Rome married us, but now we're married through Jesus. Well, that's fine. I don't care who marries you. It's all about your agreement with your partner. Whether you have a piece of paper signed by Pastor Reed or Uncle Sam himself, doesn't matter. And they're like, well, marriage is just a piece of paper. No, it's not. It's a lifestyle you've committed to someone else, with someone else, right? I don't care who signed the paper. If doesn't make it a legitimate marriage. So, if this was the case, then every relationship that has two people with mixed beliefs, then that's just two people living together. Every single one then, right? Paul's saying no. The other believing spouse is sanctified, according to Paul. He's not saying that being married to a Christian is the means of one's own salvation, is it? Is he saying that well, we better get to that. Here, sanctified, that's that word there. Sanctified. Hagiadzo, remember you see the Z, it's got a D in it in Greek. Hagiadzo, to make holy, to venerate, to be hallowed. That's what he's talking about, the marriage, not the partner. Okay? The marriage is holy. There's Christian in it. And they think about it that way. It's venerated, held in high regard, given a high name. Right? Venerated. Hallowed. In God's eyes. So, it's very simply, the belief of one Christian in the marriage makes it a Christian marriage. Because that Christian recognizes what matrimony and marital law is, even if they're baby Christians. Right? And you don't have to understand all of that when you get married either. Well, I have to go through and read all the books on marital law before I get married. No. You as a Christian, you trust God, you trust this the partner for you, go on with that. Because you either trust him or you don't. Either God's in control or he's not. Right? Okay. The unbeliever, in spite of their ignorance, is part of a Christian marriage then. Okay? They're married to a Christian. The believer's duty lies, just like we previously discussed, in being a Christian to that man or woman. Being a Christian to that man or woman because you care about them in your marriage, because you as a Christian know better. Are they always going to treat you as a Christian? Don't expect it if they're not Christian, no. Do they hold the marriage in the same high regard as you do because they understand God's laws on marriage? No, they probably won't. Don't stop being a Christian because of that. And look at, and you're supposed to do that to your husband all the way down, your lifestyle, all the way down to the children. All the way down to the children. Look at verse 14. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. Right? Some of us weren't born into the kingdom ministry or even into believing Christian households. Right? Well, your parents had to start somewhere, and so do you. So did you. Right? If the unbelieving spouse is in a Christian marriage, and because of you, that marriage is Christian, then what about the children already born? Right? The ones who are already living. This is the concern in Paul's day. Now, Corinth, like I said, was the capital of the Roman province, Achaia. Okay? And it had a large mixed population, like we said, Greeks, Romans, Jews. So not only was it mixed peoples, but it was mixed religiously. Big time. Okay? Big time. Childbirth was really risky back then. Really. As a matter of fact, in spite of all the Roman literature on medical documents and stuff that we found, the Romans, fairly advanced people. Very. Infant mortality was still 30 or 40% in those days. Okay? And that was mother and child. These are the days of antiquity. It was a dangerous thing. And as such, there was a great many Roman superstitions that had to do with childbirth. You'll find this. It's a fascinating thing, especially you ladies, okay? So, during conception and pregnancy in the Greek days where these Corinthians lived, this is what they did before they were Christians. They would pray to the goddess Virginicis, Virgo the Virgin. They prayed that they would get one. It was a big deal, even in the Bible. That's a premium. They would pray to Gigantinus that they'd get together. Conjugal. To join or yoke. Okay? It's a big deal to Roman life. Janus, the god of sowing. Janus was also responsible for a healthy womb, known as Delphus in the Roman, Latin, right? So, Concevius, god of sowing. So you see, here's, right, a maiden getting together, sowing. Alimona, you would pray to the goddess Alimona. Notice that word? Alimony. Alimony means to what? To nourish or feed. In utero. Alimona took care of that for you, right? It's a big deal. They didn't have OBGYNs. This is your OBGYNs. Right here. Here they are. This is your neonatal care. Okay? You prayed to these guys. Good, healthy wombs. Good sowing. Good nourishing in utero. To alimony. Alimona. Now the husband nourishes his ex-wife, right? Provides for. Alimony. That's where we get it. And then Sintinas, that the baby would have sentience. To perceive, right? Amazing things. These Romans were nobody's fools. Nobody's fools. They didn't quite understand in utero development, but they knew these things needed to be there. Nourishing, a good womb, Delphi, right? Now, so you see here, this was part of the Roman superstition, childbirth, because the mortality rate was so high. It's all they could do. Now, you guys know him. Since we're already here. Everybody loves Pastor Reed's Fast Facts today. That guy right there, Virginia Opossum, right? You guys know him, the old possum. We call them varmints or critters back home. Latin name is Didelphis virginiana. Now that we're already here in Rome, I figured, when I thought Delphi, I thought, oh yeah, the Virginia opossum, of course. Didelphis virginiana, which means what? The two-wombed virgin. The two-wombed maiden. Or two-wombed from the virgin land. Didelphis virginiana. That's the Latin name for the Virginia opossum. So next time you see a possum, you're like, oh yeah, Didelphis virginiana. Like, how do you know that, Pastor Reed? Pastor Reed, he was teaching about marriage, and we went over the Virginia opossum. And you're like, well, Reed, that's great, but what about that opossum word? You're missing that. That's just the Indian word for white animal. That's all they could come up with. Our nomenclature says she is the two-wombed maiden. And if you look it up, that's a non-threatened species, by the way. She is the only North American marsupial. Marsupial. All the rest are in Australia. Every single one. Except for this guy here. The two-wombed maiden. Two wombs, marsupials. They got the pouch. Like kangaroos, wombats. Oh, yeah. See? There we go. Yes. I thought everybody knew that. Okay. This is a marsupial, which means he carries his young in a pouch, and then when they get too big for the pouch, he'll carry him on his back. Right? Her back. But anyway, because it's the only North American marsupial, it has two wombs. Didelphis. Delphi means, in the Latin, center or navel. Okay, and if you look at the Greek city Delphi, they thought it to be the center of the world, or the navel, the two-wombed virgin. So anyway, that's all. I thought that was great, because I'm like, oh yeah, we're already there. Because when I saw Delphis, and I'm like, Didelphis virginiana, possum, right? It's like, just remembered, oh yeah, so yeah, that's funny. But anyway, we're right there. I figured we were dancing around it. You may as well get some, right. Now, various prayers and sacrifices were offered to these Roman gods and goddesses for this birthing thing. Okay, it was a huge, huge thing. We have tons of documents on it. Now, you would pray and have sacrifices at the home, that the baby would be born in a healthy way, that it would be born naturally. So they prayed to, there's another post avertum or something. Anyway, there's another god you prayed to avoid breech births. That was a disaster back then, right? Still not a good thing here. And you wanted the baby to open their eyes and see the lights. You prayed to Lucis for that, to open their mouth and cry. That was a big thing. That was very healthy. The Romans knew this. So they prayed for these things, sacrificed for it, rituals that would help them grow and be straight. That was a big deal, right? To grow up and be straight. So you prayed for the fates, whichever fates would, whichever fate you favored when you prayed to them, you prayed to either Nona or Decima. Okay? Nona, if she favored you, meant you got a 9-month pregnancy. And Decima, of course, meant you got a 10-month pregnancy, because the Romans knew the longer the better, right? So Nona and Decima, the fates were responsible for 9 or 10-month pregnancies. They didn't have early testing kits back then, so 9 or 10 was a pretty good guess for them. Pretty good. To encourage child growth and feeding, a bed in the house was made. Well-to-do households that had more than one room. A bed was made that nobody slept in, because it was believed Janus would come and nurse the baby divinely while everyone else in the house slept. Okay? And also a table was set in, the table was laid out and was set for Hercules. It was a big deal. Hercules came and visited the house. Hercules was to visit the house and have a good appetite, to encourage feeding, because all Greek and Roman little boys know to get big and strong like Hercules, you got to eat your vegetables, right? So they set a table for the one guy, and actually you speak about male strength, alpha male, in Roman and Greek societies was a big, big deal. If a woman really wanted to have a strong young lad like Hercules, a gladiator's blood would be rubbed in her hair for alpha blood. It was all you could do to get strong young men who grew up straight. And then they would pray to Asapago during child development for strong bones. Asa for bones. Fossil? Asa, bones. Pago, from the Latin pango, to set, insert, or fix. To have good bones inserted into the body so he could be a strong young man and eat his vegetables and get strong like Hercules one day. Karna, the goddess, strong muscles, strong meat, strong organs. She was also invoked to protect your internal organs from witches. Witches would come in and steal them. And then, of course, there's the old stragoi, who were night creatures who were known to feed on the vitality of infants. Okay? They would wake up at night and infants would scream and then be dead. Well, SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, was attributed to the stragoi. And if you really get into the ancient stragoi, ancient night creatures that screeched, that came and fed on people's blood. They were also known to change shapes and turn invisible. You go on through, eventually they will be the ancient vampires of legend. So it was attributed to them. Night creatures. So, a litany of every god and goddesses under the sun they would pray to. And this was a huge thing. And they even prayed to the muses, so that the strapping young lad or young girl would have an appreciation for the arts, sciences, and literature. Very important to Roman society, that they had strong kids. Kids that survived childbirth, wives that survived childbirth. In Greek society, especially like Sparta, if you were able to give birth and talk about it later, you're like a warrior wife. Like she was the one that gave classes on how to do this, right? It was a big deal to survive this. So, this is what these Corinthians were saying. Look, Paul, we did all this with our kids before we knew better. Like we set the table for Hercules, we prayed to Juno. Are these kids doomed? Let's phrase it another way. Paul, I've heard the gospel of the kingdom, and I've been baptized, and I'm a Christian believer. Okay, this is Paul being written to this. I was already married when I was converted, but my husband's still holding out. Am I required to get divorced now? Paul says no. Let's read another modern Corinthian convert's question. Even though I know what a Christian marriage is, but he doesn't, is my marriage still lawful to God? Yes. Am I required to get divorced? No. Even though he isn't Christian, we have a good life and we have good relations. And our home's peaceful. Can we continue? Yes. Okay. If we stay married, but he never believes, is it on me? Did I fail? Paul says, no. No. Before I was a believer, my husband and I had children. We took part in pagan prayers and sacrifices to other gods in the hope that they would be strong, healthy members of Roman society. Does that make them unclean and never able to come to Christ? No. No. Now that I know the truth, I want to raise them up as Christians in a Christian home and lifestyle. What does Paul say? They and you were both unclean when you were not believing in Christ. Right? But now that you know better, you're forgiven and redeemed. Isn't that what Paul's saying? What does he say there over there in... these are the questions Paul's being asked in these verses. These verses. Paul says this, and people love to quote this to me, but they won't quote the rest of it. Like, hey, I actually have a friend who said, look, Reed, the reason I never became a pastor was because I had sin in my life. And I'm like, yeah, well, and you were divorced, right? You was divorced or whatever, adultery of the way it was caught. He's like, I can't be a pastor now. I've been denied that, barred from that. Well, what does Paul say? Know ye not that the unrighteous shall inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves of mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. This is 1 Corinthians 6. So Paul's like, right, you won't inherit the kingdom of God, you adulterers. Then he goes on, and such were some of you, but ye are washed, ye are sanctified, and you are justified in the name of Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. So Paul says, yes, Corinth, some of you were those things, but now you know better. Some of you actually did get married for the wrong reasons. Some of you actually did have children that were born out of wedlock or sacrificed your food to other gods so they'd be strong members of society. Are you doomed? No. You were those things. Now you're Christian. Jesus' blood covers all of that. It always does. It always will. So, now that you know better, you're forgiven and redeemed, Christians. Now, with your children, sanctify them and your home and your marriage, or hold them up as a Christian in Christian regard, your home, your marriage, your husband, your wife, your children. The rest is up to God then. Is it solely upon you that they ever attain salvation? No. Yet you continue as a Christian and show them. How? 1 Peter, remember? Continue the Christian lifestyle. Continue the Christian conversation and conduct. Neither Paul nor Pastor Reed is requiring perfection. Just progress. Progress, not perfection. Like I mentioned previously, I will be preaching 2 conference sermons next week. Both Martha and I will be attending here. So, next week, I'm going to apply what we've learned in the last 3 sermons to the 2 sermons I plan on giving here. And that will be questions from the Corinthian converts to Pastor Paul. Right? Just like we did. Paul, if I have a friend who's not Christian, what am I supposed to do about that? Well, continue showing them the Christian walk and go in peace. There's one. Wouldn't that be something we could all learn Right, yeah. We're going to do that at the conference. While I'm not here, next week, I'll be giving the conference sermons here, and then the week after that, I'll be back. We'll wrap up this whole series, because that's going to be a nice little caveat to this little thing on marriage and divorce. We will be having normal service here next week, of course. We'll have a sermon posted online. It'll probably be a bit delayed, but it will be there. That will be, my wife Margaret will be speaking and bringing a message in my absence. So I'm just letting you know that now. If you have a problem with a female declaring the gospel and glad tidings, then don't tune in. Just like Jesus said, there are some to whom will receive it and some won't. So if you don't want to receive it, tune it out. It's probably not for you anyway. But she will be giving a message on Sabbath. Sabbath. Because that's part of a Christian conversation, is it not? She's going to get around. While I'm here preaching the kingdom, she's going to be here preaching the kingdom. Yes, preaching the kingdom on Sabbath. Sabbath. I encourage you to tune in. That will be Sunday. She'll be doing that. And we will also have, I've already had people ask, we will have the messages from the conference. I will get those edited and uploaded sometime after I return. So yes, we will have those. Pastor Matt Dyer is really good about getting those online as well. So don't worry, you won't miss those if you can't attend. And that's all we have for today. We'll close in prayer.